She fainted in the dust with nowhere to go. The cowboy brought her to his home to heal. "Please, just a little water." The words were a dry rasp, swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky. The sun beat down on the cracked earth, bleaching the world to shades of bone and straw. Nothing moved save for the shimmering heat that rose from the wagon ruts of the long-abandoned trail. It was a silence that buzzed, a heavy, oppressive quiet that spoke of endings, a place where hope came to die. From the shade of a lone, skeletal cottonwood, Silas watched. He had been watching for the better part of an hour, a dark shape against the weathered gray of his small cabin, motionless as the rock formations that dotted the horizon. He'd seen them first as a smudge of movement in the distance, a slow, painful crawl that resolved itself into the figures of a woman and a small child. The woman pulled a rickety handcart, its single wheel groaning with every turn. The boy, no older than 5, stumbled beside her, his small hand clutching the rough fabric of her skirt. Silas was a man accustomed to solitude. He had chosen this place for its emptiness, for the way the wind scoured the land clean, just as he hoped it might one day scour his memory. The arrival of strangers was an intrusion, a disruption to the rigid, silent routine that kept the ghosts at bay. His first instinct was to remain hidden, to let them pass as all things did in this unforgiving landscape. Let them become another story the dust would tell. But he stayed, his eyes narrowed against the glare. He saw the woman's shoulders slump with each step, the way her head drooped lower and lower. He saw the child's legs buckle, the small body listing with exhaustion. He recognized the particular brand of desperation that drove people out into the Badlands, a flight from something worse than the certainty of sun and thirst. He had known that desperation once himself. It had a taste, metallic and bitter, like blood on the tongue. He watched her stop. She swayed, her hand flying to her temple. The cart, laden with a few pitiful bundles, tilted and fell onto its side. The boy gave a small, weary cry. The woman did not seem to hear him. She took one more staggering step, her knees giving way as if her strings had been cut. She collapsed in a heap, a small cloud of amber dust rising to mark her fall. She did not move. Silence. The boy stood over his mother, his small face a mask of confusion and fear. He patted her shoulder, his touch gentle, his voice a thin whisper that the wind carried away. "Mama!" Something inside Silas, a rusted hinge deep in his chest, gave a painful creak. He had spent years fortifying himself against the world, building walls of silence and labor. He had his chores, his horses, the rising and the setting of the sun. It was enough. It had to be enough. But the image of the small boy standing sentinel over his fallen mother was a crack in that wall. It was a sight that clawed at a memory he kept buried, a memory of another small hand, another silent plea he had failed to answer. He pushed himself off the post he'd been leaning against. The movement was stiff, reluctant. Every step he took toward them felt like a betrayal of the vow he'd made to himself, a vow to remain apart, to cause no more harm by connection. The dust crunched under his worn boots, the only sound in the vast stillness. The boy looked up as he approached, his eyes wide and dark in his grimy face. He didn't run. He simply stood his ground, a tiny, defiant protector. Silas stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over them. He looked down at the woman. Her face was turned to the side, cheek pressed against the hot dirt. Her bonnet had fallen away, revealing hair the color of sun-scorched wheat, matted with sweat and dust. Her breathing was shallow, a faint flutter in her chest. She was exhausted, starved of water and hope. Left here, the sun would finish its work by dusk. He looked at the boy. "She your ma?" The boy gave a single, jerky nod, his chin trembling. Silas knelt, his knees cracking. He reached out a calloused hand, not to the woman, but to the overturned cart. He righted it with one smooth motion. Then he looked back at the boy, his voice low and even, stripped of any emotion that might cause alarm. "We'll take her to the house. Get her some water." He didn't wait for an answer. with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. He slid his arms under the woman's shoulders and knees. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile collection of bones and weary muscle. As he lifted her, her head lolled back, and a small, sighing breath escaped her lips. He held her against his chest, the unfamiliar weight both a burden and an anchor. He started the slow walk back to the cabin, his steps measured and sure. The boy hesitated for only a moment, then grabbed the handle of the handcart and trudged along behind him, a loyal shadow in the merciless afternoon sun. A change was coming. The wind whispered it through the dry grass, and Silas felt it in the fragile weight he carried in his arms. It was the beginning of something, or perhaps, the end of his long, lonely penance. He carried her inside, into the cool dimness of the single-room cabin. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and solitude. He laid her gently on his own narrow cot, the straw-stuffed mattress rustling beneath her. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, a flicker of unfocused blue, before closing again. The boy stood in the doorway, clutching the cart handle, a small, dusty sentinel silhouetted against the blinding light from outside. He was a creature caught between two worlds, the harsh, indifferent wilderness behind him and the strange, shadowed shelter before him. Silas moved to the water barrel in the corner, his actions deliberate and unhurried. He ladled water into a tin cup, the sound echoing in the quiet room. He brought the cup to the woman's lips, tilting it carefully. A few drops trickled past her mouth, tracing clean paths through the grime on her chin. She moaned softly and, as if guided by instinct, began to drink. She drank with a desperate, shuddering thirst, her throat working convulsively. When the cup was empty, her head fell back onto the thin pillow. Silas refilled the cup and held it out to the boy. The child watched him, his dark eyes filled with a caution far beyond his years. He did not take the cup. Silas set it down on the edge of the small, rough-hewn table. "It's for you," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't press. He understood that trust was a currency the boy and his mother no longer possessed. It had to be earned, not demanded. He turned his attention back to the woman. With a damp rag, he began to gently wipe the dust from her face. Her skin was hot to the touch. He cleaned her forehead, her cheeks, the line of her jaw. Her features, emerging from the mask of dirt, were fine-boned and etched with hardship. She was younger than he had first thought. He worked in silence, his large, rough hands moving with an unexpected tenderness. It was a task that felt foreign and achingly familiar all at once. He hadn't touched another person with such care in years. Not since. He pushed the thought away, locking it back in the dark place where it lived. The boy finally let go of the cart and crept into the room. He stood by the cot, his gaze fixed on his mother's still face. He watched Silas's every move, his small body tense, ready to fight or flee. "She'll be all right," Silas said, more to himself than to the child. "Just needs rest. And water." He rose and moved to the stone hearth where a pot of beans from the night before sat cold. He stirred the embers in the firebox, adding a few small pieces of kindling. He wasn't a man given to planning, but a new, unspoken plan was forming. They would need to eat. They would need to stay, at least for a night. The thought sent a tremor of unease through him. His life was a carefully constructed fortress of solitude. He had just carried the Trojan horse through his own gate. Alara woke slowly, drifting up from a deep, dark well of exhaustion. The first thing she registered was the scent of wood smoke and something savory, like beans and bacon. The second was the blessedly cool air on her skin. She was not under the scorching sun. She was inside, lying on something soft. Her eyes opened to a ceiling of rough-hewn wooden beams, darkened with age and smoke. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Where was she? Where was Leo? She sat up too quickly, and the room spun. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she fell back against the pillow with a groan. Easy now, the voice was deep and calm, coming from across the room. Her eyes focused on a man sitting at a small table, his back to her. He was large and broad-shouldered, wearing a faded blue shirt. He was cleaning a piece of tack, his hands moving with slow, methodical purpose. Beside him, at the same table, sat Leo. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Leo was spooning beans into his mouth from a wooden bowl, his small face serious with the task of eating. He was safe. The knot of fear in her chest loosened just enough for her to breathe. "Leo?" Her voice was a croak. The boy looked over, his face breaking into a relieved smile. "Mama, you're awake." The man at the table did not turn around. He continued his work, granting her the privacy of his stillness. "Your boy was hungry," he said to the wall in front of him. "There's a bowl for you on the hearth when you're ready." Alara pushed herself up again, more slowly this time. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, her worn boots still on her feet. The cabin was small and sparse, but immaculately clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A few shelves held tins and sacks of flour. A rifle rested on pegs above the door. Everything in the room spoke of a solitary, self-sufficient existence. There was no sign of another woman, no touch of softness save for the faded quilt that now covered her. She looked at the man's back. She remembered a shadow falling over her, the feeling of being lifted, the strength in the arms that carried her. He had saved them, but survival had taught her that saviors often came with a price. She was wary, her body humming with a low-grade fear that had become her constant companion. "Thank you," she said, the words stiff in her throat. "For the water." He gave a slight nod but did not stop his work. The sun is no place for a woman and a child. His lack of engagement was, strangely, reassuring. He wasn't fawning over her, nor was he making demands. He was simply stating a fact. She stood on shaky legs and made her way to the hearth. A bowl of beans, still warm, sat waiting for her next to a tin cup of water. She picked it up, her hands trembling from weakness and hunger. She returned to the cot and began to eat, the simple, hearty food tasting like the finest meal she'd ever had. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against wood and the soft crackle of the fire. When she was finished, Alara felt a measure of her strength return. The world was no longer spinning. The despair that had crushed her out on the trail had receded, replaced by a cautious, fragile flicker of hope. She looked at her son, who was now watching the man's hands as he worked the leather. Leo had always been a quiet, observant child, made more so by the hardships of their journey. He seemed unafraid of this large, quiet man. That, more than anything, settled some of her fear. When the man finished with the bridle, he hung it on a hook by the door. He finally turned to face her. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, and they held a deep, unshakable weariness that she recognized, for it was a mirror of her own. He wasn't old, perhaps 40, but he looked as if he had lived several lifetimes. "You can rest here for the night," he said. His tone was flat, matter-of-fact. It was an offer, not an invitation. "The boy can sleep at the foot of the cot. I'll take my bedroll by the fire." "We can't pay you," she said immediately, her voice sharp with a defensive pride. "We have nothing." He looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes seeming to see right through her worn dress and tired facade, to the resilient, frightened core of her. "I didn't ask for pay." He picked up a bedroll from the corner and spread it on the floor near the hearth, his back to them once more. It was a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. He was offering shelter, a roof and a fire, and he expected nothing in return. For Alara, who had learned that every kindness was a debt, this simple, unadorned charity was the most unsettling thing of all. She lay back down, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Leo, his belly full, crawled onto the end of the cot, curled into a small ball, and was asleep in moments. Alara lay awake long after the cabin had grown dark, listening to the man's steady breathing from across the room and the lonely cry of a coyote in the distance. He had saved them from the sun, but she wondered what new, unknown wilderness they had just entered. She was a survivor, and her instincts screamed at her to be cautious. But for the first time in months, she was not cold, she was not hungry, and her son was sleeping safely beside her. It was a precarious kind of peace, but it was peace nonetheless. She closed her eyes and let the exhaustion she had held at bay for so long finally claim her. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Silas would rise before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake them. He would tend to his 2 horses, milk the single goat, and then head out to mend fences or check his traps, disappearing for hours at a time. He never spoke of his work, but before he left, he would always ensure the water barrel was full and there was a stack of fresh wood by the hearth. He would leave food on the table, a portion of whatever he had, be it smoked meat, beans, or a few precious potatoes from his small, struggling garden. Alara, in turn, established her own domain within the small cabin. She rose when she heard him leave, her body slowly regaining its strength. She swept the rough plank floor, washed their few meager belongings in a bucket, and mended the tears in Leo's shirt with thread she painstakingly pulled from the hem of her own dress. She found she had a knack for making the beans last, for stretching their limited provisions. She would prepare a simple meal in the evening, leaving a portion on the hearth for Silas when he returned, long after she and Leo had gone to bed. They existed in the same small space but moved in different orbits, their paths rarely crossing. The silence between them was vast, a landscape as wide and empty as the plains outside. It was not an angry silence, but one of deep, ingrained caution. They were 2 wounded animals sharing a den, each respectful of the other's pain and solitude. Leo became the unwitting bridge across this silent divide. One morning, while Silas was oiling his saddle on the porch, Leo crept out and sat on the steps, watching him with wide, curious eyes. He didn't speak, just watched the man's large hands work the oil into the old leather. After a long while, Silas stopped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden horse. He'd made it years ago in another life for another child. He held it out to the boy. Leo looked from the horse to Silas's face, then back again. He slowly reached out and took it, his small fingers closing around the smooth, worn wood. He didn't say thank you. He simply clutched the horse to his chest and ran back inside to show his mother. Alara saw the exchange from the doorway. She saw the offering and the flicker of something, pain, memory, regret, in the man's eyes before he turned back to his work. Later that day, while Silas was gone, she took one of the worn-out shirts from her cart and began tearing it into strips. She spent the afternoon cleaning his rifle, her movements precise and efficient. Her father had taught her how to care for a firearm. When Silas returned that evening, he found the rifle gleaming on its pegs, a small, neat pile of oiled rags beneath it. He looked at the gun, then toward the cot where she was pretending to be asleep. He said nothing, but the next morning, a small sack of flour appeared on the table that hadn't been there the day before. It was their way of speaking, a language of gestures, of quiet reciprocity. A mended strap on her handcart, answered by a pot of thin stew left simmering on the fire. A bucket of wild berries he left on the doorstep, answered by a row of his shirts, washed and neatly folded on his bedroll. They were building a fragile truce, one small, silent act at a time. But trust was a different matter. Alara remained vigilant. She never slept soundly, her ears tuned to any change in his breathing, any unexpected movement in the dark. She still felt like a guest, a temporary resident whose welcome could be revoked at any moment. She didn't know his name, nor he hers. They were simply the man, the woman, and the boy, labels that kept a necessary distance. One afternoon, a week after their arrival, the sky began to change. The endless, pale blue was bruised with shades of purple and gray along the western horizon. The air grew heavy and still, charged with a tense, waiting energy. Silas came back from the plains early, his face grim as he scanned the darkening sky. "Storm's coming," he said, his first unsolicited words to her in days. He didn't look at her, instead focusing on securing the shutters on the cabin's 2 small windows. A bad one. He brought the horses into the small, sturdy barn and led the goat into a lean-to attached to the cabin. Alara watched him work, his movements economical and sure. He was a man who understood the land and its violent moods. She gathered Leo close, pulling her cart further under the meager protection of the porch overhang. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, kicking up little puffs of dust. Then the wind came, a low moan that grew into a furious howl, whipping the rain into horizontal sheets. The world outside the cabin dissolved into a gray, roaring chaos. They were trapped inside together, the storm shrinking their world to the 4 walls of the small room. The wind shrieked, and the cabin groaned under its assault. Leo, frightened by the noise, began to cry. Alara held him tight, murmuring soothing words, but her own heart was pounding. The fury of the storm felt personal, a physical manifestation of the turmoil she had carried inside for so long. It was during the height of the storm that she noticed Leo's skin was hot. His cheeks flushed a feverish red. He had been listless all day, but she had chalked it up to the oppressive heat before the storm. Now, a familiar, sickening dread coiled in her stomach. She knew this heat. She had felt it before in her husband, in the last days before he was taken by the lung fever that had swept through their camp. "He's burning up," she whispered, her hand pressed to her son's forehead. Silas, who had been standing by the window, peering out into the maelstrom, turned at the note of panic in her voice. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt by the cot. He placed the back of his hand against Leo's cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle. His expression tightened. "Get the rest of the water," he commanded, his voice sharp with an authority she hadn't heard before. "And tear a strip from that sheet." Without questioning, she did as he said. He took the wet cloth from her and began to bathe Leo's face and neck, trying to bring the fever down. The boy whimpered, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "I need herbs," Silas muttered, more to himself than to her. "Willow bark." Yarrow, he looked toward the door, then at the sheets of rain lashing against it. "Damn this storm." He stood and went to a small, dusty chest in the corner, one she had never seen him open. He rummaged through it, pulling out dried bunches of herbs and small leather pouches. He worked quickly, crushing leaves and roots with a stone, his face set in grim lines of concentration. This was a man who knew about loss, she realized. He was fighting this fever with a ferocity that seemed born of old, bitter experience. The storm raged all night, and so did the fever. Silas did not sleep. He sat by the cot, forcing sips of a bitter tea between Leo's lips, constantly replacing the cool cloths on his forehead. Alara sat on the other side, holding her son's small hand, her body rigid with fear. In the flickering lamplight, stripped of their silence and their distance, they were no longer strangers. They were 2 people united in a desperate, silent battle against the encroaching darkness. She watched him, his large frame hunched over her small son. She saw the deep worry in his eyes, the gentle way he spoke to the boy, his deep voice a soothing rumble beneath the howl of the wind. The walls she had so carefully maintained around her heart began to crumble. In this small, storm-battered cabin, in the face of her deepest fear, this quiet, solitary man was not a threat. He was an ally. He was her only hope. Toward dawn, the wind began to subside, its roar diminishing to a weary sigh. The rain softened to a steady drumming on the roof, and inside the cabin, Leo's breathing evened out. The fierce heat began to recede from his skin, leaving behind a damp, healthy sweat. The fever had broken. Alara let out a sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief that she had been holding in for hours. She buried her face in the quilt, her shoulders shaking. She felt a heavy hand on her back, a brief, comforting pressure. "He'll be all right," Silas said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "He's a strong boy." When she looked up, he was already moving away, stoking the fire, putting the world back in order. The crisis had passed. But something between them had irrevocably shifted. The storm had passed, both outside and in, leaving behind a world that was washed clean, quiet, and new. The morning after the storm was hushed and gleaming. The air, scrubbed clean by the rain, smelled of wet earth and sage. Puddles of water stood like mirrors, reflecting the soft gray of the dawn sky. Inside the cabin, Leo slept peacefully, his fever gone, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, reassuring rhythm. Alara sat at the table, a tin cup of hot, bitter coffee cradled in her hands. Silas sat opposite her, performing the same ritual. The silence that returned was different from the one that had existed before. The caution and suspicion had been washed away with the fever and the rain, leaving behind a quiet space that felt less like a barrier and more like a shared territory. "Thank you," she said, her voice low. She looked at him directly, meeting his tired, gray eyes. "You saved him." He gave a slight shake of his head, dismissing her gratitude. "The boy has fight in him." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "I had a son once. He didn't." The admission hung in the air between them, stark and unadorned. It was the first piece of his past he had ever offered her, a key to the locked room of his solitude. Alara felt a pang of shared sorrow. She understood now the source of the deep weariness in his eyes, the reason for the small, carved horse in his pocket. "I had a husband," she offered in return, her own piece of the past. "Leo's father. The fever took him last winter. We were with a wagon train heading west. After he was gone, they said I was a burden, a widow with a child. They left us in the last town with nothing but what I could carry." She stared into her cup, seeing the faces of the people who had abandoned her, their expressions a mixture of pity and impatience. "I was trying to get to Fort Bridger. I heard there was work there. For women. Laundry, cooking. Anything." He listened without interruption, his gaze steady. He didn't offer empty platitudes or easy comfort. He simply listened, and in his listening, she felt a profound sense of validation. He understood the cruelty of the world, the fragility of hope. "My wife, Sarah, she died birthing our boy," he said, his voice flat, as if reciting a well-worn, painful fact. "The boy, he followed her a week later. There was nothing the doctor could do. Nothing I could do." He looked down at his own large, capable hands as if they had betrayed him. "I sold the farm back east. Came out here where the land is empty. Thought the quiet would help. But the quiet, it just makes the ghosts louder." There it was, the shared landscape of their grief. They were both refugees from a past that had stolen everything from them. They had both sought solace in motion, in solitude, only to find that memory was a relentless travel companion. "My name is Alara," she said softly. He looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He seemed to realize they had shared the most intimate details of their lives without ever having shared their names. "Silas," he replied. A simple exchange, but it felt like a formal treaty, the drawing of a new map. The routine they fell back into was subtly different. The silence was now companionable. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would sit on the porch steps, carving a piece of wood, and she would sit in the doorway, mending. They didn't need to speak. The shared space was enough. Leo, fully recovered, now followed Silas around like a shadow, helping him with his chores, chattering away to fill the quiet that the adults still cultivated. Silas never scolded him. He would listen to the boy's endless stream of questions and answer them in his slow, deliberate way. A ghost of a smile would sometimes touch Silas's lips as he watched the boy, a sight that made Alara's heart ache with a tender, unfamiliar warmth. One day, Silas announced they were low on flour and salt. "We'll have to go to town," he said. The word "we" hung in the air. He wasn't sending her away. He wasn't going alone. He was including her. The thought of facing a town again, of seeing the judgment in people's eyes, sent a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in Alara's stomach. But the thought of staying behind while he and Leo went felt even worse. This small cabin, this isolated patch of land, had become her sanctuary. All right, she agreed, her voice firmer than she felt. The town was little more than a dusty street lined with a dozen false-fronted buildings. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a few houses. It was a place that felt temporary, a precarious foothold against the vastness of the plains. As they walked down the main street, Silas leading one of his horses packed with furs to trade, Alara felt the familiar stares. The women who swept their porches paused to watch them, their eyes lingering on her patched dress and the weary lines on her face. The men loitering outside the saloon fell silent, their gazes dissecting her with a casual cruelty. She pulled Leo closer, her shoulders hunched, trying to make herself smaller. Silas seemed oblivious to the attention, his face an impassive mask. He tethered the horse outside the general store and went inside. Alara and Leo waited outside, not wanting to draw more attention. It was then that she heard a voice that turned her blood to ice. Well, well, look what the wind blew in. I thought I told you to get out of my territory. She turned to see Mr. Sterling, the self-important land agent from the last town, the man who had overseen the wagon train and had personally cast her out. He was a portly man with a florid face and small, piggish eyes that were now fixed on her with a look of smug disdain. I'm just passing through, Alara said, her voice trembling slightly. She stood in front of Leo, shielding him. Passing through, Sterling scoffed, his voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear. Looks to me like you're still peddling your sob story. Poor, helpless widow. You should be ashamed, using that boy as a beggar's cup. Heat flooded Alara's face. The humiliation was a physical blow, stealing her breath. The townspeople were watching, their faces a mixture of curiosity and contempt. This was what she had feared, this public shaming, this reinforcement of her worthlessness. We'll be on our way, she said, trying to pull Leo away. But Sterling stepped in front of her, blocking her path. Not so fast. A woman like you, a vagrant, is a blight on a decent town. We don't want your kind here. At that moment, the door to the general store opened, and Silas stepped out, a heavy sack of flour on his shoulder. He took in the scene in an instant. Alara's pale, stricken face, the sneering man blocking her way, the ring of silent, watching faces. He set the sack down with a heavy thud. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to shift the focus of the entire street. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he was standing beside Alara. He put a hand on her shoulder, a simple, possessive gesture that spoke volumes. Sterling looked Silas up and down, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. This woman is a vagrant, a drifter. She's no concern of yours, friend. Silas looked not at Sterling, but at Alara. His gray eyes were steady, calm. Then he turned his gaze to the land agent, and the calmness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard glint of steel. She's with me, Silas said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a gunshot in the silent street. He let the words settle, letting every person there understand their meaning. He was claiming her. He was protecting her. He looked around at the watching crowd, his gaze daring anyone to challenge him. No one did. He then fixed his eyes back on Sterling. And this is my concern. You will leave her be. You will not speak to her again. Now get out of her way. It was not a request. It was a command, backed by the unspoken promise of violence. Sterling, a bully who preyed on the weak, withered under the force of Silas's conviction. He flushed, sputtered for a moment, then gave a curt, angry nod and pushed his way through the crowd, disappearing into the saloon. The spell was broken. The townspeople, denied their spectacle, went back to their business, though they cast furtive glances their way. Silas picked up the sack of flour as if nothing had happened. He looked at Alara, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Let's get what we need and go home, he said. Home. The word resonated deep within her. He had not said back to the cabin or back to my place. He had said home, in the middle of that dusty, hostile street, under the weight of public humiliation. This quiet, solitary man had stood for her. He had given her his protection. He had given her his name, his reputation. And he had given her a home. The tears she had refused to shed in front of Sterling now welled in her eyes, tears not of shame, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. She nodded, unable to speak, and followed him into the store, her hand resting protectively on her son's shoulder. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, but the silence was of a different quality than any they had shared before. It was a silence filled with the unspoken weight of what had happened in town. Alara, riding one of the horses while Leo sat in front of Silas on the other, kept replaying the scene in her mind. "She's with me," the words echoed, a shield and a promise. She would glance over at Silas's profile, the hard line of his jaw, the steady focus of his eyes on the trail ahead, and feel a sense of safety that was so foreign it was almost frightening. When they arrived back at the cabin, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. The place looked the same. The weathered wood, the stone chimney, the small barn, but Alara saw it with new eyes. It was no longer just a temporary shelter, a refuge from the storm. It was the place Silas had called home. It was the place he had invited her into, not just with his actions, but now with his words. As Silas unsaddled the horses, Alara began to unpack the supplies. She moved with a new sense of purpose, a feeling of belonging that settled deep in her bones. She put the sack of flour in the corner, arranged the tins of salt and coffee on the shelf. These were not his provisions anymore. They were theirs. That evening a change began. It was subtle, a series of small actions that signaled a shift from temporary to permanent. The next morning, Alara walked to the small patch of earth behind the cabin where Silas's meager garden grew. The soil was rich, darkened by the recent rain. She found a rusty spade by the barn and began to turn the earth, clearing a new, larger plot. She would plant something. She didn't know what yet, but she would plant roots, literally and figuratively. She would make this barren ground productive. She would contribute not just to their survival, but to their future. Silas watched her from the barn doorway for a long time, his expression unreadable. He didn't interfere or offer help. He simply watched her claim a piece of this land for herself. Later that day, he went to the woodpile and, instead of chopping firewood, he selected 2 long, straight logs. He spent the afternoon on the porch, working with a drawknife and an auger, his hands moving with a familiar skill. He was building something. Leo, now fully at ease in his world, spent his days in a state of happy exploration. The fear that had haunted his young face was gone, replaced by the dirt-smudged curiosity of a little boy. One afternoon, he sat on the porch steps with a piece of charcoal from the fire pit and a flat piece of scrap wood. He drew, his tongue sticking out in concentration. When he was finished, he brought his creation to Silas. It was a child's drawing, simple and crude. A square for the cabin, a triangle for the roof, a wisp of smoke coming from the chimney. And standing in front of it were 3 figures. A large one, a medium one, and a small one, all holding hands. Silas took the piece of wood from the boy. He stared at the drawing for a long time, his thumb tracing the charcoal lines of the 3 figures. He looked over at Alara, who was on her knees in the new garden patch, her hands buried in the dark soil. He looked at Leo, who was beaming up at him, awaiting his approval. A deep, shuddering breath escaped Silas's chest. For years, his home had been a monument to loss, a place of ghosts and silence. He had lived with the specter of an empty chair, a silent cradle. Now, this small boy had handed him a picture of a new reality. Family. He nodded at Leo, a gesture of profound acceptance. "It's good," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Very good. He didn't hang the drawing on the wall. Instead, he propped it on the small shelf inside, next to the tins of coffee and salt, where he would see it every day. It was a cornerstone for the new life they were building, brick by silent brick. The days melted into weeks, and the weeks into a season. The fierce heat of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The cottonwood down by the creek turned a brilliant yellow, its leaves rustling in the cooler breeze. A new, comfortable rhythm settled over the inhabitants of the small cabin, as natural and steady as the turning of the earth. The home that had been declared in a dusty street was now being built, plank by plank, through shared work and quiet companionship. The garden Alara had started yielded a small but satisfying crop of squash and hardy greens. Her work transformed the patch of barren ground into a symbol of their shared persistence. Silas, in turn, finished his project. It was a rocking chair, sturdy and simple, made from the cottonwood he had felled. He placed it on the porch, not in the corner where an old, broken one had once sat, but in the center as if it were a throne. He never sat in it himself. It was for her. In the evenings, after the chores were done and Leo was asleep inside, Alara would often sit in that rocker, a mending basket in her lap. The gentle creak of the wood on the porch planks became a familiar, soothing sound, the heartbeat of their quiet life. Silas would sit on the top step, cleaning a bridle or sharpening a knife, the familiar tasks seeming less like chores and more like a form of meditation. The silence between them was no longer a void but a vessel. It held the unspoken understanding that had grown from shared hardship, mutual respect, and a quiet, burgeoning affection. They had no need for the grand declarations or flowery words of a world they had both left behind. Their language was in the way he'd leave a freshly filled bucket of water just inside the door for her, or the way she'd place a hot plate of food on the table for him when he came in late from the fields, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. It was in the way her hands would still for a moment in her mending when he coughed, or the way his eyes would follow her as she moved about the cabin, a soft, protective light in their gray depths. From silence came warmth. From stillness came a profound and binding connection. One evening, a chill wind whispered of the coming winter. Alara was in the rocker, pulling a thick wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. Silas came out and stood by the porch rail, looking out at the vast, star-dusted sky. "Winter will be hard this year," he said, his breath pluming in the cold air. It was a statement of fact, but she heard the underlying question. Winter was a time of isolation, of being trapped. It was a test. She stopped rocking. "We have enough wood chopped, and the squash will last, if we're careful." She looked up at him, her face illuminated by the pale moonlight. "We'll manage." The word, "we," was a quiet confirmation of everything that had passed between them. It was an acceptance of the coming season, an affirmation of their partnership. He nodded slowly, a deep satisfaction settling in his chest. He had spent so many winters alone, the cold outside a mere reflection of the cold within. The thought of facing this one with the sound of a creaking rocker, with the warmth of another soul in his house, was a gift he never thought he would receive. He turned and went back inside. A moment later, he returned with his own heavy sheepskin coat, the one he wore only in the deepest cold. He walked over to the rocker and draped it over her shoulders, over the blanket she already wore. The coat was heavy, imbued with the scent of him, leather, wood smoke, and the clean, cold air of the plains. It settled around her like an embrace. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the dark. "Thank you, Silas. You'll need it," he said, his voice gruff to hide the tenderness of the gesture. He sat on the step, close to her chair. The silence returned, comfortable and deep. The rocker began to creak again, a steady, peaceful rhythm in the vast, cold night. They sat like that for a long time, two solitary figures who had found a shared stillness, a quiet harbor in a turbulent world. The ghosts of the past were still there, perhaps they always would be, but their voices were fainter now, drowned out by the gentle, persistent sound of a life being lived, of a home being made. The first snow fell in the night, a soft, silent blanket that transformed the harsh landscape into something pure and gentle. When Alara woke, the world outside the small window was a vast expanse of white, the light inside the cabin soft and diffused. Leo was already awake, his face pressed against the glass, his breath fogging the pain as he stared in wonder at the transformed world. The fire in the hearth crackled merrily, a bulwark of warmth against the cold. Silas was already gone, his heavy boots having left the first tracks in the fresh snow, heading toward the barn to see to the animals. Alara felt a sense of profound peace settle over her. The coming of the snow did not bring the familiar dread of scarcity and hardship. Instead, it felt like a beginning, a clean slate. The cabin felt smaller, cozier, a sanctuary sealed off from the rest of the world. This was their world now, these four walls, the small barn, and the endless, quiet white. She made breakfast, a thick porridge with a dollop of precious molasses. When Silas came back in, stamping the snow from his boots, the warmth and the smell of the food enveloped him. He hung his coat on a hook by the door. Next to it hung her own thin, worn shawl, two items side by side claiming their space. He washed his hands in the basin and sat at the table without a word, but his eyes met Alara's across the room, and in that shared glance was a deep, unspoken contentment. After they ate, Leo, bundled in every layer of clothing they could find for him, was allowed to go out and play in the snow for a few minutes. Alara and Silas stood in the doorway watching him. He stumbled through the deep powder, his laughter a bright, clear sound in the muffled silence. He fell backwards, making a snow angel, his small arms and legs scything through the pristine surface. For the first time, Alara saw Silas truly smile. It was not the ghost of a smile she had seen before, but a real, deep smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and erasing years of weariness from his face. He was watching Leo, but the smile was for more than just the boy's joy. It was a smile of redemption, of a heart that had been frozen for years finally beginning to thaw. The day passed in a comfortable domesticity. Silas repaired a harness in the warmth of the cabin, the scent of leather polish mingling with the wood smoke. Alara sat by the fire, using a precious needle to patch the knee of Leo's trousers. They moved around each other with an easy, familiar grace, the small space no longer a confinement but a shared universe. As evening fell, the snow began again, soft, fat flakes drifting down in the twilight. Leo, exhausted from his adventure, was already asleep on the cot, the small wooden horse clutched in his hand. The cabin was lit only by the flickering firelight, which cast dancing shadows on the walls. Silas put down his work and came to stand by the hearth, staring down into the flames. Alara finished her stitch and set her mending aside. The quiet in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sigh of the wind outside. She rose from her stool and came to stand beside him. They stood for a moment, side by side, two shadows watching the flames. This was it, she thought, the culmination of all the silent days, the shared meals, the quiet acts of kindness. This was the peace she had stopped believing could ever exist for her. She reached out, her fingers hesitant at first, and then gently, she placed her hand on his forearm. His muscles tensed for a fraction of a second, then relaxed under her touch. It was the first time she had initiated contact, the first time she had willingly bridged the small physical space between them. He did not look at her. He continued to stare into the fire, but he slowly, deliberately, turned his arm and covered her hand with his own. His hand was large, calloused, and wonderfully warm. It enveloped hers completely, a gesture of quiet, powerful possession and profound acceptance. There were no words. None were needed. Everything they had to say to each other was contained in that simple, profound touch. It was a promise of shared winters, a vow of mutual care, a silent acknowledgement that their broken pieces, when placed side by side, had somehow made a whole. The firelight bathed them in a warm, golden glow. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the old tracks, covering the scars on the land, making the world new. Inside the small cabin, two lonely souls had found their shelter, not just from the storm, but from the solitude that had haunted them for so long. A hand resting on his, she stayed.